Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Penguin Random House Book and Author Festival hosted by Library Journal. My name is Andrea Gough. I'm an adult services librarian at the Seattle Public Library, and I'll be moderating this session today on literary fiction. The novels featured today, like the best of literary fiction, feature beautiful writing, deep characterization, and probing questions. I'm so excited to welcome our speakers today. Sarah Gilmartin, author of Dinner Party from Steerforth Press, Allegra Goodman, author of Sam from the Dial Press, Rachel Heng, The Great Reclamation, Riverhead Books, Rachel Joyce, Maureen, Dial Press Trade Paperback, and Tiffany McDaniel, On the Savage Side from Knopf. One note that Tiffany is unable to join us today, but we'll be reading her responses on her behalf. Welcome, everyone. So we're just going to jump right in with you, Sarah Gilmartin. So Dinner Party opens on Halloween 2018 as Kate prepares a family dinner to mark the 16th anniversary of her twin sister's death. The novel examines several key periods in Kate's life, delving into the family dynamics that have brought her to a precipice of decision-making. So this is your debut novel. Can you tell us a bit about your path to publishing this book?
Sure. So I'm a journalist by trade, an arts journalist. So I review books for a living. So I've obviously always been interested in reading and in books, and latterly in writing. So I started by writing a couple of short stories, and knew it was something I wanted to get into more. So I did an MFA in University College Dublin in 2018, 2019, with Anna Enright and a couple of other really, really good teachers. And from that point on, I grew this novel. It started life as a short story, and it grew to become a novel eventually.
That's fantastic, thank you. And we'll definitely dig in a bit more to some of the themes as we go along. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Allegra Goodman, in your novel, Sam, the reader watches Sam grow from ages 7 until 19. The book is told in kind of a close third-person perspective, and Sam's voice is such a distinctive, strong feature of this novel. How did you find her voice?
So I started by writing it by hand, and I find that's often a good way to get into the voice of a character or the narrative voice of a book. And I started with the first sentence. There's a girl and her name is Sam, and which is sort of a very 7-year-old childish way of thinking about yourself. And it just sort of all went from there. And I just tried to grow her from there, from the inside. So I would say writing it by hand, and also thinking of it like almost as if I was performing the character, like an actor, learning about her and then delving deeper and deeper.
That's great. It's neat to see her voice change also as she grows during the book, as she grows up. So Rachel Heng, in The Great Reclamation, you tell the story of Singapore from the 1940s to the 1960s through the eyes of a fisherman's son, Ah Boon. From the waning days of British colonization to occupation by the Japanese, revolutionary fervor, self-determination, and the rapid push for modernization. What prompted you to tell this story from this perspective at this time?
Thanks. So I'd grown up hearing, many stories about Singapore from family members, like from parents, grandparents, older family members. And the way they talked about it, I guess, had always felt like it was a different country, like almost as if we had moved from a different place. And it seemed so strange that so much had changed in, just 40 years. And it always felt like it was 200 years ago, right? Or 300 years ago, a different century, the way my mom would say like, oh, back in the olden days. And it felt like we were talking about the 19th century. And I think as I got older and read more and sort of understood more about Singaporean history, I would read about something that happened in the 40s or 60s and realize, how close that was to our current lifetime and how massively the island had changed, like just geographically, but also socially, and also in terms of language, right? So the fact that I speak English and my my grandmother can't say my first name, essentially, though we never moved. It's almost like an immigration story, but set in the same physical location. And so I think this is something that maybe anyone who writes historical fiction to some extent is trying to figure out, like, how did we get here, and what happened, right? Like, how did we end up in this place? What are all the different things that, all the different factors and stories and kind of coincidences that brought us to this moment in time and made us the people that we are. So I think I've always wanted to write about this period in Singapore's history because it's the 20 years preceding independence. And when the country sort of says, okay, we're going to be independent now, we're going to be our own country and create a new world essentially and reshape the island and build all of these roads and skyscrapers and teach people, send people to public school. And that sense of kind of hope and optimism, but also the loss that comes with it because of all that's being left behind or built over. So I guess from a personal standpoint, that's why I wanted to write the book. And then from a sort of literary standpoint, one of my favorite novels is Stendhal's The Red and the Black, which, if people are familiar with it, is about a young boy who grew up in the countryside who kind of wants to go to the big city and make a name for himself, right? And it's a Bildungsroman, and him sort of growing up and coming of age and realizing all the things he has to give up in order to become the person that he wants to be. And so I think I always wanted to write a book that was sort of like that. And Abun is kind of a Julien Sorel character in Singapore in the 40s to 60s.
Thank you. Yeah, as I start to dig into your book, it did what I love, what I love from historical fiction, which is I felt so compelled by the characters, but also like I was learning a lot, which is a nice balance. So Rachel Joyce, those who read The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry or The Love Song of Miss Queenie Hennessy will recognize Maureen from those books. And she now takes her own abbreviated journey to reckon with her son's death. Did you always know that you were going to tell Maureen's story? And what prompted you to tell her story now? And what did it feel like to revisit this world and these characters after some time away?
It was actually a reader who came up to me pretty soon after The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry was published at a kind of event like this, and said to me, "You do know that it's a trilogy, don't you?" And that was my first book. I felt relieved I'd got to the end of one. I couldn't believe anybody was suggesting I had to write another two. But I did know that she was right. I knew that it was a trilogy about 3 transformative journeys. And I don't, inner journeys, but also physical journeys. And I wrote Queenie's journey quite soon after Harold's. And it was a sort of, I knew that her journey reflected his, even though hers was one of waiting and his is one of walking. But Maureen's, I could not get. I could not find it. And over the years, I've written 3, and I don't just mean the beginnings, I mean the whole thing. And I've just about had, I've got to the end and I've thought, I don't believe it. It's just, it's not true. So I've abandoned them and then gone on to other things. But then coming to lockdown, when we were all so much kind of suddenly really living our lives within the space, the kind of confines of 4 walls, I really thought about Maureen a lot. And I thought about how much I was thinking about the past. And that if I had a past like Maureen's, that would be something that would suddenly be very, very present again. And that actually I could see I could see what her journey was, and I could see how I could help her. There was also the fact that I was then writing the screenplay for the first book, for The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry. So I was completely back in their world again. And after the filming of Harold Fry, it was really as if Maureen just came and sat right next to me and said, "Come on, are we going to do this book?" And I thought, yes, yeah, we are. I get it now. But it's taken me 10 years to be brave enough, because it's a difficult journey.
No, absolutely. And for readers who, like me, may not have read the first 2 books yet, I want to say I started with Maureen and now I want to go back and fill out the rest of the story.
Right.
So my next question is for Tiffany McDaniel. And so I'll read the question and then we'll read her response. So Tiffany's novel follows twin sisters Ark and Daffy as they grow up in a town and in a family wrecked by addiction. So tell us about your decision to center your novel on these sisters. And here's her response.
I grew up in both central and southern Ohio and communities affected by drugs. I played with kids who were like Ark and Daffy. kids whose parents were addicts, and kids who suffered, only not under the strain of that, but the abuses that come with it, including the failures of the system in terms of protecting kids like them. Kids who, in many cases, went on to have their own addictions, like the characters in the book. As I reflected on the real-life victims who were murdered, I wanted to imagine who they might have been as kids. I wanted the readers to be there with Ark and Daffy as they aged, to get a sense of how those early years affected them throughout their lives.
I'm muted. That's an excellent response. Thank you. I'm going to jump back to Allegra Goodman, following up a little bit from that earlier question of voice in your novel, Sam. Many of your previous novels have had larger casts of characters with the story told from multiple perspectives. So what prompted you to focus so closely on Sam in this book, and what was that writing experience like?
So what prompted me was that I wanted to focus on one person's evolution. And in order to do that, I had to not write about everybody all at once from every perspective, although I love doing that. I had to give up that polyphony, and I had to go deep into one person. And really, when you're writing about one person growing up, it's all the people that she is, as she gets older. And as I was writing her, and the narrative actually changes, the language of the book changes as she gets older and her mind opens and her heart opens. I kept envisioning those sort of time-lapse photographs of like a flower, like a seed, sprouting, or a flower opening. Except I was doing it with language instead of with pictures. And so I guess it was a sense of sort of giving up a more panoramic view and going much into portrait, a dynamic portrait mode.
I love that idea that it's still about multiple people, because as we grow, we're different people. That's really neat. It's very neat.
Thank you.
Yeah. Going back to Rachel Heng. So as you were talking about before, your novel pulls from real historical events, 30 dynamic years in Singaporean history. And so I wanted you to tell us a bit about the research that you did and about weaving together the fictional and the factual.
Well, it seemed hugely intimidating when I started. And for many years, I think is why I didn't write this book. But I guess I read lots of sort of general history books just to understand the time period. I read a lot of books about land reclamation and kind of, I guess, what would that fall into, engineering or construction, like understanding like how concrete piles are used to like stabilize land, because part of the book takes place on this coast that's being reshaped. I spoke to lots of professors who were very kind. So a fun thing that I learned while writing this book is you can pretty much email many people and they will just respond and very kindly share with you all of their expertise. And so I spoke to one of my favorite conversations was with a professor of geography who is an expert in mangrove swamps in Southeast Asia. And one of his classes that he runs is a walk along the old coast of Singapore, which is actually in the interior of the island because the coastline has shifted so much. And so he brings you to this temple that is right in the middle of the city, like in the city center, that I always thought of as, it's in this really urban developed place. And he was like, this used to be a sea temple because that's where the fishermen would pray before they would go launch their boat. Now it's just a regular temple. It's still dedicated to the goddess of the sea, but it's in the wrong place. And so I think the research was really fun, and was just probably the hardest thing was getting out of it and actually trying to write the book instead of spending a million years like just reading about it.
Thank you. And I think that temple pops up towards the end of the book. I remember that detail. I have another question for Tiffany McDaniel, and it's a bit similar. So on the savage side, draws from the story of the Chillicothe Six, or the 6 unsolved deaths and disappearances of women in Chillicothe, Ohio. Tell us about the research you did. What about this inspired you to write this story, and about weaving together fact and fiction?
When I started to research the crime, I recognized the photo of one of the women who had disappeared in Columbus and who has never been found to this day. We had gone to school together. My other connection to the women in Chillicothe was that they had been best friends of another one of my childhood friends. Added to that, I had known women like those victims in not only my community, but in generations of my family. Those whose paths led them towards addiction and the lifestyle that comes with it. While I had spent a lot of time in Chillicothe throughout my childhood, part of my research was visiting the sites again, like the paper mill, the motel, and the river, where some of the women's bodies had been recovered. While the characters of my novel are not based on real-life victims, the story of violence was inspired by the crime. But more than these women being victims, I wanted to write a story that captured the spirit of who they might have been.
Thank you. It's the women themselves in the community really come through in this novel, and the sense of themselves as individuals, and also that sense of loss. It was powerful. We're going to pop back over to Rachel Joyce. So part of Maureen's journey in this book is about finding and allowing interpersonal connection after so many years of being closed off by grief. So tell us a little bit more about charting Maureen's path, and a bit more about how it's different from Harold and from Queenie's.
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier, which I was grateful for, it is a standalone book. I always forget to say that it is supposed to be a standalone book, so you don't have to have read the other two. But just to answer the last bit of your question, I think Harold's journey is I mean, he's not a sort of big, loud man, but he's an extrovert in essence, in that he is able to connect with other people and increasingly finds himself willing to connect and to sort of awakening sense of nature. So he is, kind of extrovert. Queenie is a creative person. She finds her kind of release in writing about how she feels, and then in this kind of garden that she's created, which is full of kind of celebrations or connections with the people that she's loved in her life. Maureen has neither of those things. She is not an extrovert and she is not a creative person. She is an introvert who's 72 and whose grief has kind of, I think, probably as a result of lockdown as well, has made her more enclosed within its walls. And I think there is a point with grief where it can become your identity and even your kind of slightly safe place. It's sort of how you express yourself, and you're unwilling really to let go of it, because to let go of it means you don't know who you are anymore. So her journey is an introvert's journey, and she's somebody who finds it very, very hard to connect with people, and she also says the wrong thing. She's rude when she doesn't mean to be rude. She kind of just does the wrong things. So she sort of has all my sympathy, really, because she's a woman who doesn't have the equipment to kind of make the change that I, as a writer, want her to be able to make. So I think that was for kind of one of the reasons it was such a difficult book to write, and because I resisted it for so long, was because the change that I could see she needed to make, I could not see how to bring it about for her, because she's so locked in the past and in her grief.
Thank you. And those themes of grief are some that we'll touch on again in a few minutes, but it's powerful. Sarah Gilmartin, I found the sibling relationships in your novel to be really captivating. And we get to see these relationships at several different points, when the characters are teenagers and when they're adults. So tell us a bit more about those relationships and about the impact of having your main character, Kate, be one of a pair of twins.
So Dinner Party really is about a big, messy Irish farming family and the losses that unite and divide them over time. And it's told from the perspective of Kate, of one sibling, but like Allegra was saying earlier, when it came to the idea of perspective and voice, I did toy around with maybe making it the perspective of many siblings, but ultimately it came back to the fact that Kate was Elaine's twin sister, and Elaine died when the girls were 16, so really the story was hers. But they come from, the remaining siblings, of which there are 3, come from a fairly erratic, difficult family. And, you know, there's plenty of humor in it. There's a formidable Irish mother at the centre of proceedings who provides much of the drama and hopefully a few laughs along the way. But really the siblings are bonded together because of, you know, because of their childhood, you know, the rivalries, the tensions, but also how they ultimately looked after each other and looked out for each other during it and beyond.
Yeah, thank you. It was neat to see how their relationships with one another changed and how they were both challenging and supportive to Kate. So we are going to return a little bit to this theme of grief because many of your novels grapple with grief in some way. So we're going to go one by one, but I'd love to hear from each of you about the narrative role played by grief in your novels and kind of the process of writing those storylines. So Rachel, Joyce, you've already spoken about it a bit, but Maureen is still feeling deep grief for her son, David, dead for several decades, which she has never fully reckoned with. Oh, I think you're still muted.
There we go. Sorry. The grief that she's experiencing is a very old one. And I would say she's been through all the stages of grief that we know, you know, the kind of bargaining, the anger, the blame, the remorse. You know, she's done them all. But the thing is that just because you've done the steps that you're supposed to do doesn't mean that actually inside you're healed. And she is still, it's kind of still very, very alive for her. So to the point where she can't even go now to a book group and talk about a book without feeling that the book has content which relates to her. So she's become like the world is sort of, she's so disconnected that she is both kind of going to things and feeling a complete outsider, but also actually experiencing them as if she's right in the middle. So she's that, you know, she's kind of in that place of conflict. So that was the one, you know, that's why she needs to release herself from it. But I think one of the reasons that it was so hard for me to write was because when I first started writing Harold Fry, I was in a very deep place of grief myself. And actually, it's taken 10 years for me to realize that actually I was ready to say goodbye to it. But it has taken 10 years. And it was really actually only the experience of watching them filming the book that I realized I was ready to kind of, you know, step away.
Thank you. So Allegra Goodman, back to you. So throughout your novel, Sam's father is a bit erratic and he's there and he's not. How do those missed opportunities for connection with her father impact Sam and the grief over that relationship? And how does that shape her?
Yeah, I think I was really interested in writing about what it's like to love somebody deeply and be disappointed by them constantly. And as Sam gets older, I was interested in how her perception of her father changes. And she goes through different phases, as we all do, with people who frustrate and, you know, and break our hearts, essentially. And she has to figure out, on the one hand, she has to figure out sort of who he is and what he means to her, but she also has to figure out who she's going to be in the wake of him. You know, she's scared by her resemblance to him. You know, she's inspired by him in some ways. You know, she has to wrestle with those questions, and that's a central part of her growing up.
Thank you. Back to Sarah Gilmartin. So you mentioned a bit earlier, right, that kind of the nexus of this book is the death of Elaine at age 16. And so Kate feels that grief for her sister, for who Elaine would have been and who they would have been together. So tell us a bit more about grief and about writing that.
Yeah, there's a line in the book. I mean, I think it's particularly interesting if you're one half of a twin that gets left behind. There's a line in the book where Kate says she feels halved by grief and halved again. And there's also the feeling a little bit that I think because of how other family members act, that she feels that the wrong twin was taken, that, you know, she feels, I guess, a kind of a survivor guilt that she's still there and that her sister is gone. I think it was interesting what Rachel said about identity as well, how grief can kind of become somebody's identity in a way that, you know, you don't know who you are if you don't have it. I think that's certainly true of Kate and probably the wider family. Again, there's another line in the book that they're no longer the Gleasons, but they're known as the poor Gleasons in the neighborhood because of the loss and various other losses they go through. And that view of both internally of, you know, who we are after we suffer a loss and also how other people view us, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This next question is for Tiffany McDaniel. So I watched an online interview you did for your last novel, Betty, where the interviewer noted that in dark circumstances, your characters find hope and beauty despite that darkness. I feel like that's true of this novel too, particularly in the way your twin characters weave stories to recast bad experiences. Is this a recurring theme or narrative choice that you have in mind from the beginning of your projects, or something that comes out as you write?
What comes natural to many of the narratives I work on is exploring those situations that feel hopeless or desperate, and then following the journey of the characters on their way to finding their own strength to survive the circumstances that threaten to erode and test us. In the case of Betty, that book involved interviews with my mother, Betty, and living family members, so I was weaving pieces of their lives, and that was united by my own experiences of having known them. But with Betty or any book, I don't plan the story or journey. It's more of an organic evolution that takes place as I'm crafting scene by scene and is released as I write.
Excellent. And then rounding out, Rachel Heng, your character Ah Boon goes through so many changes, as does Singapore. And it feels like there is a complicated grief for the disappearing world of his childhood, even as he helps affect those changes.
Yeah, so the story of my novel is also, aside from the changes that take place in Singapore, also a love story between Ah Boon and his childhood best friend, a girl called Seok Mei. And both of their characters, in a way, are shaped by grief at a very young age. And I think the story, it's an interesting question where you said grief as what role does grief have as a character, like in the narrative, right? And so I was thinking about that as sort of an active force over both of these characters' lives. And I hadn't thought about it that way before, but in many ways, their stories are their reactions to the grief that they're grappling with. So Ah Boon loses his father during World War II, and then Seok Mei is an orphan when he meets her from the very beginning, because her parents have gone off to fight this revolutionary war in China. And their reactions to that, even though they stem very much from the same place, and it's that shared grief that allows them to connect and to bond, to sort of understand how each other feels and their place in the world. But their reactions to that grief are also the source of their immense conflict eventually, that Ah Boon feels that because of what happened to him and his family, he needs to kind of fall in with people in power. He needs to be on the side of strength, so this can never happen to him again. He needs to protect them, to build up, to change. And that's sort of part of the changes that he helps to effect. And the fact that he feels that even this sacrifice is necessary. He's like, I need to build a fortress around me, myself, my family. I will never lose anyone again, right? Seok Mei, on the other hand, is beholden to the values that her parents left her for. So because her parents left to be revolutionary, she has to be revolutionary. She's like, I will never fall in with the powers that be, who are the people that Ah Boon end up siding with. Because in her eyes, if she did that, it would firstly be a betrayal of her parents' belief and love, but also it would sever the very connection that still connects her to the people whom she misses so dearly. And so I think most of the narrative, if anything, is propelled and inflected by this grief that strikes both of them at a very young age.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's interesting across your novels to see the different ways that grief manifests and the different ways that different characters kind of grapple with it, which is one of the things I love about fiction, right? Is that we get to see those different ways of trying to deal with a very universal human emotion. So thank you all. So these next questions are kind of about when you all set your novels. So Rachel Joyce, you've spoken about this a little bit, but the novel Maureen takes place 10 years after the events in the pilgrimage of Harold Fry. How did you choose that 10-year time span, and what impact did it have on the story that you told?
Well, originally I wasn't thinking of I was thinking that the book had to be set at the same time as Harold and Queenie, and actually Harold Fry came out 10 years ago now. So it was, as I said, it was the experience of lockdown that made me think, oh, hang on, this book is set now. And it was a sort of one of those moments of relief where you think, of course, I was staring at it the whole time. I just didn't, actually pick it up. So the book is set where Harold and Maureen, 10 years after he's made this walk kind of across England in order to try and save his dying friend. And Harold and Maureen have been able to kind of go back home. But 10 years later, and obviously post-lockdown, he is a man who's kind of diminished physically, whereas she is somebody who still has this, this thorn, this spike under her skin. It's like sort of every time she walks, something gets her in the shoe. And so kind of having that 10-year gap means that I can kind of go back and look at the world of Harold Fry and question whether I still believe in it. And there has been so much change in the last 10 years that it seemed very important to me, since Harold Fry is so much a book about community and connection and kind of really the beauty of the landscape, to see for myself if I ever, still believed in those things. I mean, and the other thing, of course, is that if you just have a little bit of a kind of time kind of gap like that, you have that perspective, which means you can find humor. And humor for me is really, really important in a book, especially if you're talking about grief. You need to be able to laugh at this person, as well as kind of understanding why they are the woman they are and the pain that they're in.
Thank you. So my next question is for both Allegra and Sarah. So we'll start with Allegra and then Sarah. The characters in your books are teenagers in the late 1990s. What about that time period spoke to you?
I guess it's on the one hand, it's fairly recent past, compared to sort of writing a World War II narrative or something like that. On the other hand, it feels like ancient history, since so many things have happened since then. This is before really social media, the internet existed, but social media hadn't really taken off. So being a teenager is quite different. But I felt close to that period because that was a period when my children were growing up, the late 90s, early 2000s, when Sam is growing up. And, while I inhabit Sam's voice and her world, I also inhabit her parents' world. And I knew what it was like to parent somebody during that period. That said, all those details that make it so specific, that specific time period, that specific place that my book takes place in, the North Shore of Massachusetts, there's a lot that's sort of similar to any time period in terms of just struggles with your mother, frustrations with your father, all those growing up things aren't so different, even though technology has changed so much.
So Sarah, how about you?
Yeah, with Kate, I wanted to show a character at different stages of life. So yeah, one of the stages that we see her in is when she's a teenager. I think she's around 13 or 14 in when the book is in the 90s. And I was roughly around that same age in the 90s. So it was really fun to kind of throw in those period details that kind of, stay somewhere in the back of your head and just emerge whenever you're writing onto a page. So I don't know, like the depressing lyrics of Radiohead or Converse or My So-Called Life or, whatever it might be. I think Tamagotchis got in there as well, which I had completely forgotten existed until I started writing that period. So I find it enjoyable to kind of recreate, a period that's a while ago, a little bit longer than I realized. But still in recent enough memory that those details were still to hand. And obviously, we've got the internet these days as well, so that's a great help too.
Excellent. Well, I think you both do such a good job of bringing that decade or that time period to life. But I was also a teenager in the 1990s, so I saw a lot of things that I recognized and identified with. So back to Rachel Heng. So you already spoke a little bit about setting your novel in the 30-year time period between 1940 and 1960s. But I wondered, how did you know when to stop?
I stopped because it got too long. Originally, I planned for it to be a 3-part book and called intergenerational. So my original plan was for Abun to be a young boy, and then kind of a young adult, and then an older adult with children, and sort of grappling with the changes that he affected in his 20s. But then I got to the period of the 20s, and the book was 140,000 words long. And then there was this whole middle section of his teenage life that I felt was pretty crucial, and wasn't that fleshed out. Like I'd done maybe 1 or 2 chapters in that time period. And so sort of practically, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be able to get to the final period that I had envisioned. And also, I think we need to fix this middle section in order to make the ending work. So unfortunately, I didn't know when to stop. The book kind of naturally stopped, or I was constrained by the 140,000 word length.
Very nice. Well, it feels like a good stopping point. It feels like a complete story. So it worked. I wanted to take a little bit of a step back from themes and whatnot and talk a little bit about writing process. I imagine, most of these novels had at least part of their writing happen during the pandemic. Some of you are debut novelists, some of you have been writing for many, many years, some of you are on your second novel. But I wanted to just kind of ask, what was the experience of writing or editing during the pandemic? Are there things that you think you'll take out from it as positives that you continue as you write, or everything you'll kind of leave behind? And we'll go ahead and we'll start with Sarah on that.
I had mostly finished writing the novel when the pandemic started, so I was editing it and I was working on my next novel, Service. I was lucky in that I don't have kids, so I actually had quite a lot of quiet time. I have a lot of friends who are writers who have kids, and it was not like that. Because they were at home, but for me, it worked well. I found maybe it was a little bit more difficult to have a collaborative process, to get feedback and things like that, or to get outside your own head or your own space, as it was, so difficult for everyone within the pandemic. But it was a great escape as well. If things were tough, no matter what was going on here, you could kind of escape back into the writing and have a little bit of a different world in a way that when the real world was actually quite shut down.
Absolutely. Allegra Goodman, how about you?
So Rachel, Joyce, what you said resonated with me, because I'm also a writer who sometimes has to write a book multiple times, the whole thing multiple times. And that's what I've done with this book and with others. And when the pandemic hit, I was realizing I had to rewrite this book. And I used to call Sam my problem child, because I was so frustrated. And I also had a house full of people. My husband was here, our 4 children were here, and my daughter-in-law was here. There's 7 of us in the house. And it was, I had no privacy, no time to myself. And so what started out as something I dreaded doing, which is going back into this book, which I was stuck on, became a solace to me, which is sort of the way Sarah was talking about, that I could at least go back into her world. And I found, and I was one of those people, I just worked all the time that I could. It was like my comfort. There are a lot of things that I couldn't do that I like to do. And I wasn't allowed to, or, I swim and the pool was shut down, and my friends were sort of like, go to Walden Pond and swim in the pond. And I was like, it's November and I grew up in Hawaii. I can't do that, So I had my book, and that was when I really sort of had my breakthrough with this book. And instead of being my problem child, she started to fly. So.
That's excellent. She found her moment.
Yeah.
So Rachel, Heng, how about you?
So like Sarah, I had finished writing it and was revising it. And I find revision difficult in the best of times. And so in pandemic times, I think it was even more challenging, because I think life was already pretty isolated before that. Just as a writer, I was in my MFA, I had just finished it, and my MFA was 3 years long, and we don't teach. So it was, it was great to focus on writing, but also it's like very kind of blinkered and lonely sometimes. And so the pandemic just exacerbated all of that. And I was in Austin, Texas, where many people still didn't believe that COVID was real. And so I kind of hunkered down and was like, I'm just not going to go out, right? And in the beginning, it was great. It felt like a, nice escape. And I was like, oh, I know how to do this. I'm a writer. I like being by myself and in front of my computer. But then I think after 3 months or so, I started to go a bit still crazy. And and I think that was, it's strange when you ask about it, it's all a blur now. I don't know what happened or what I did, but I think I just kept trying to write and trying to revise, and it happened in fits and starts. And, I didn't have children or distractions. So I was fortunate in one way and very lonely and isolated in another. And kind of just working in, trying to create some kind of schedule at home to not just, have the time be this undifferentiated mess. And I think I finished one revision in 2020, and then I sold the book at the end of 2020. So that was a good kind of injection of fresh energy, because then I had an editor to work with and I got her feedback. And then the next year, things started to get a bit better with like vaccines and everything. So writing felt a bit more, possible, feasible.
Thank you. Rachel, Joyce, how about you?
Oh, it was a disaster for me. I just couldn't write a word. I had 4 children back home, grown up, and I think my head was normally I'm somebody who is so grateful for my imagination and that kind of escape and release and everything everyone's been describing. But I was so appalled and aghast and kind of frightened for everybody. Just frightened, not for myself, but for what it meant. That kind of access to my imagination just was not there. It was like a closed door. And I also had just had a book come out over here. So I had a book, Miss Benson's Beetle, hit every lockdown in the UK. We had 4, and this poor book hit every single one of them. So as a proof, it hit the first one, then it came out as hardback, it hit the next one, and then in paperback, it hit another one. So it was just like having something incredibly precious that I just had to leave by the road and kind of walk away from. And I hadn't had that experience with a book before. I hadn't realized how much I enjoyed the communication and the kind of contact with other readers to understand what the book was, just to see it from outside itself. So it was only really when I began working on the screenplay of Harold Fry that I finally, and it was Harold and Maureen and Queenie kind of just took me back into my creative space. But I remember looking at Instagram, and it would be, somebody else would be saying, I finished another book. And I was just thinking, my God, how can I not write a word and everybody else is finishing them?
Absolutely. Just because we were locked down didn't mean we couldn't compare ourselves to others, right? So tracking back this next round, back to your books, I would love to know what you hope readers will take away from your book. And we'll start with Sarah Gilmartin.
I hope that they will get to know a family, first of all, get to know what it means to survive a family. So the kind of like impossibilities of family, but also all the great things about family. That they'll also get to know a little bit about Ireland. Like the book has different parts, but it's set in Trinity College at one part of it. So, some of it's in Dublin, some of it's in rural Ireland. So get to know the sense of place, get to know the family, and also just kind of really connect with with the main character, Kate, and get an idea of what she's going through. And that's about it.
Thank you. Allegra Goodman, how about you?
When I was really little kid, I remember I wanted to be a writer, and I remember thinking, I want to remember exactly how it is to be a kid so I can tell everybody later when I'm a writer. And this is the book where I think this is what I'm trying to do in this book. I want people to remember what it was like. So that's what I'd want them to take away.
Excellent. Thank you. Rachel, Heng, what are you hoping that readers will take away from your book?
I just hope that they enjoy it and find it interesting and connect to the characters. And I hope that that the people seem like real people to them, because they felt like real people living in my head for so long and living through this time of great change. And I hope that they're moved by them.
Rachel, Joyce, how about you?
Well, it's always, for me, it's sort of like just that you've been on a kind of imaginative journey that you can believe in, which is kind of, you know, what books do for us. But also, I'm always interested in celebrating people who are on the outside and who fight, you know, who kind of act in a slightly ridiculous way, but in a kind of lost way. And so I think it is just about understanding people for whom it's harder than it is for the rest of us.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think we have a response from Tiffany McDaniel as well about what she hopes folks will take away from her book.
I hope readers take away that with victims of crime, it's important that all the victims' stories are amplified, regardless of race, gender, and class. When I first heard about the murders of the women, there was a sense in the community that because they were linked to addiction and prostitution, that they were active participants in their own death. In the book, I try to highlight that the women were mothers, sisters, and daughters, and that they mattered. That's important to remember.
All right, thank you all. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thank you to all the librarians and educators joining us today. I hope you'll go out and recommend these books, read them yourselves. They are excellent for individual readers, and I think they're all also really good book club picks. So if you're looking for things to recommend to your book clubs. But that's all we have with this group for today. Next up are two concurrent panels, Lived Lives and Past Tense. Happy reading all.